All right, we are live with Ed Thompson from Matillion, and we've got our Katie Kleiner on with us at Intricity. Ed, thanks for joining us here for Data Sharks.
Good, Jared. Thank you.
Yeah,
Nice to meet you, Kenny.
I've been excited for this interview because Matillion is really just kind of like a train going through the ETL market, and and Ed, just for your awareness about just our audience here at Intricity 101 on the channel as well as on the LinkedIn, it spans a really wide audience. I mean, we have people that are solution architects, and we go all the way down to college students, and it's somewhere between 80 to 100,000 views a month, and so it's a really broad audience. And so I always like to ask our guests, to explain the problem that their solution is solving. And believe it or not, like sometimes solution architects forget that crumb trail about about how to explain a problem. So even for them, it's helpful because then they can go, oh yeah, that's how I should explain it to a business person. So give us what is it that your solution is doing? What's the problem it's solving?
Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Jared. So Matillion is a bit of software that's designed to make data useful. And the way it does that is we saw, businesses have more and more data than they've ever had. One stat that we pulled from our own customer base between March 2020 and March 2021, which at the time was the COVID era.
Yeah.
I'm not sure if we're allowed to mention that. Between those two date points, our customers' data grew 2.5x. So the amount of data they were moving through our software grew 2.5x just in that 1 year. So you got this crazy growth in data, you got this crazy growth in volume of data, and you've also got this crazy growth in the number of silos of data that exist in any business. And partly that's down to the fact, hey, it's really easy for someone in a business, almost of any size, to start up a silo of data. You can go to a new SaaS platform, you can pop in your credit card details, or hopefully the company credit card details, and suddenly you've created this new silo of data. And before you know it, that's a silo of data on which the company relies. So bringing together all of those silos of data in a central way has never been more important. So you have the silos of data. To bring the data together in a central way, the obvious choice really is a data warehouse or a data lake. But the hard bit really is getting the data into the data lake and then getting it to the point where it is useful. And that means having processes that transform that data from all of the source formats that it comes in. And modern systems are really nicely built. They come with great models that have really clean metadata underneath them. And you look at the data that's coming out of those systems, and it's quite easy to understand. But they're all still built by different people. So they all still comes in a variety of formats, and you have to do quite a lot of thinking and quite a lot of work to bring that to something that's common. And then quite a lot of work to apply the rules, the data rules, and the business logic for your own organization on that data. And that's what we do in an ELT process. So we're pulling the data in from the silo, we're loading it into the data warehouse, and then we're transforming it and applying the rules to give you a single, clean, what we probably describe as an analytic-ready data store. And that's a data store which you can use to do straightforward analytics, ask and answer questions, self-service analytics, build dashboards, build reports, or more commonly these days, and probably more excitingly, you need really clean, high-quality data models in order to feed downstream AI and ML systems. So there's no good training a machine learning algorithm on poor quality data, because you're just going to get for quality learning and more quality result. So you have to put the work in up front. One of the big bugbears of people that employ very expensive data scientists, you employ your very expensive data scientist, and what do they spend most of their time doing? Cleaning up.
Data munging.
Data munging. When what you really want them to be doing is figuring out the next genius ML algorithm that's gonna revolutionize your business. So that's the core part of it. It's the EL and the T. Our main product we call it Matillion ETL. So it's not an ETL product; it's an ELT product. We'll get into the difference, I think, in a little bit. But when we launched it, everybody was Googling ETL because everybody thought they wanted an ETL product. So that was the only reason it got. I think that was the only reason it all got called that.
Yeah, I like to explain it to people when we're talking about ETL. Is that the logic for turning this raw feed of data into information has to live somebody or somewhere. Has to live somewhere. It can either live inside of somebody's head. It can live in a scripted query, or it can live in a mechanism that is visual that turns that into code for you. And that's one of the aspects of Matillion that I've liked, is that it has the CLT model, which we'll get into, but it's visual. You can you've got widgets, and those widgets mean something, and they turn it into code that gets pushed to the appropriate target. So.
Yeah, Jared, I've used your analogy of data as a factory. So the video that you have around data as plastic is probably a perfect example of that. But data arrives as a raw material, and information emerges through that ELT process, and that's precisely what I think Ed you're alluding to. It's that today, and I've used the example of Pareto 80-20 rules, where you've got 80% of your time is spent on data munging, where it should be spent on the analytics, and maybe 20% is the data munging part. But the idea of having that raw material, that data coming in the traditional ETL world, would have required you to set up all of these processing servers living outside of your core data transformation engine. And of course, ELT, as Ed, I'm sure you'll talk about, sort of moves that closer to where it really needs to be, which is where the data is.
Yeah,
definitely.
And Ed, I noticed when I was looking at the founding dates of Matillion and your joining of Matillion, I was like, okay, Ed's like been there since the very get-go, it seems. Was that a group of friends like getting together and going to each other's garages to do development, or or was it a little more structured at the get-go? So tell me about those early years.
Yeah. Oh well. Give me a chance to put on my rose-tinted spectacles, Jared, and go back. So February 2011. Matillion's CEO is a gentleman called Matthew Scullion, who I think a few guys you will have met. So it was himself and myself that were lucky enough to set up Matillion from the start. We had worked together previously at a small consultancy firm, and that had kind of been where I'd kind of cut my teeth. We were an IBM consultancy. We worked with kind of sort of heavyweight IBM technology. WebSphere was kind of my specialty. I knew a bit of DB2 and some of the kind of rational product suite around IBM, and it was our experience there. Kind of, first of all, it informed that we probably didn't want to go up and set up a consultancy firm, because you guys know well, running a consultancy is hard, and it's a great place to learn a lot of stuff. But we were kind of excited, like, well, let's try and build a service or a product company. And then the other thing, we'd had a little bit of exposure. We'd had very little exposure to kind of the world of BI and data, but we had a little bit of exposure to kind of one IBM product, which is called Cognos. It's like a very heavyweight a data analytics platform.
Yep.
Anyway, so we set up Matillion ETL, and the business plan and the idea behind the business plan and the idea kind of behind the seed investment was that we would build a company that would do business intelligence as a service. And the idea was, hey, this cloud thing's pretty cool. We can stand up infrastructure pretty easy and pretty cheap. And business intelligence projects inside of organizations were, at that time, and to be honest, still are, massively expensive.
Yeah.
So the idea was that we would build a system that allowed us to create like a turnkey data warehouse. So we'd go in with a data warehouse that was like 90% designed, and then we'd tailor it for the customer. And we would make that so turnkey and so easy and so affordable that we'd be able to sell it to kind of small, medium enterprises in the UK. And that's what we did. So we built some software to help you design and tailor a data warehouse. And we used off-the-shelf software to do kind of a visualization front end. So we used a bit of software called Jaspersoft. And we also used an ETL tool called Talent, which I know you guys are pretty familiar with. And that was kind of our stack. And we were kind of neither failed nor was successful. So we built up this company, and we had to about 30 or 40 customers, all of which were hard fought over the course of about 4 or 5 years. And it was incredibly hard work because small customers are no less demanding than large enterprises. That's right. They still want a highly tailored data warehouse, and they want it to work really well. And so we were essentially doing full data warehousing projects for very little money, and a service charge.
So was it like so it was like an annual fee type?
It was an annual fee. We knew we wanted a kind of an annuity model.
Yep.
So there was like a setup fee which barely covered anything, and then there was an annual fee, and then the rest of it was just me and a small bunch of guys just working really hard.
Hard. Yeah.
Try to build and run all these data warehouses, so what we realized, and you only see this in hindsight, right? When we were doing it, we just thought this is how hard it is to run a business. But looking back, so what we realized after about sort of 3 or 4 years of doing that, we were like, okay, this is not going to turn into an exciting business unless we change the model quite a bit. Yeah. And if you looked at what we were doing, most of the time, most of the effort was in ETL. So we were spending our time building ETL processes, testing them, deploying them, running them, upgrading them, and iterating them for customers. And I think the customers essentially, they got as much change in their ETL process as they wanted included in the fee. So they could just make up what they wanted on the morning, and we go, okay, yeah, we'll build that in. So it was tough. So anyway, but what we realized was that the ETL software was the thing that was holding us down. And it was holding us down partially at development time, and it was also holding us down at runtime because it simply wasn't able to scale and move data fast enough. And even small companies had massive quantities of data. And we were just starting to see even quite small companies deploy lots of IoT devices, and those IoT devices were pumping out large quantities of data. We were trying to handle that, and the kind of system was running out of steam. So we needed something more scalable, and that's when the cognition.
Explain to some of the college student types. The pipe was the ETL tool was actually transforming the data in process, right?
Yeah, so that's the way a traditional ETL tool works. So it pulls the data. It pulls the data from the source. It transforms it in flight, and it pushes the data to the target. And that sounds great, but the problem is scaling that middle bit. So that middle bit that transforms is the bottleneck, and it's possible to scale it, but it's expensive and complex to scale it. And at that time, there wasn't great technology to kind of sit in that place. We spent a lot of time looking at things like Apache Hadoop, because that really was kind of the first turn of the handle at like, okay, we've got complex data operations that we need to parallelize and scale out. And Apache Hadoop, it's kind of been and gone now, but it didn't really, it did scale, but it was very, very complicated to build and set up and to manage. And so for a small company, it would have been a big struggle to deploy that with all of the other complexity that we'd built up by having all these kind of different customers. So the cognition then was, okay.
So what year are we at, right, roughly?
So we're around 2014 here. We're around 2014. So we're 3 or 4 years into the company. And we kind of realized, and we'd start, in some of the ETLs we'd started to build, what we'd started to do was we'd started to load data directly from source into the data warehouse. And the data warehouse that we were using at that time was called, I forgot the name of it. It was a columnar database. It was kind of a niche product, which is the reason I've kind of my mind's gone blank. But it
circa
was
2014. I would think Sybase IQ perhaps, or something similar to that.
No, it wasn't Sybase.
No?
It was like a precursor. It'll come to me before the end of the session. I'll just blurt it out.
That's how memory queries work as well.
Yeah. So it was a precursor to Redshift. But it was like an on-prem thing that we hosted and built. So yeah, it was a columnar data warehouse, but we'd already started to realize that for some kind of operations, the best thing to do was to write queries against the database. So you'd move the data into the database, and then we'd write some SQL queries just to kind of finish off the data transformation. And what we realized was, hey, actually, for almost everything that we're doing, the data warehouse can handle all of it. Right. That was at the same time as AWS, which were already, everything's getting deployed into AWS, but they released this new product called Redshift. And we were busy trying to figure out if Redshift was going to work better for us. And I don't know if you guys ever experienced the first iteration of Redshift. Yes. It was slow. So we were kind of surprised. We got this old data warehouse that we've been using for years. A brand new thing came along, and it was slower. And we're like, oh, okay. Well, we'll give that another 6 months and see where they get to. And of course, they iterated on Redshift. Redshift got a lot better. So what we decided to do, like, hey, the only way we're going to make this a successful business is if we can compress the amount of time and effort that we're spending on ETL, because that has to get a lot shorter.
Now, this was still in the mindset of servicing these clients, or was it
it's make our BI business work?
Yeah, lower cost of serving those customers, cost and time.
I love it. I love it.
That was the thought. We're not realized at this point that we can maybe lots of this. So we set about building from scratch an ETL tool that focused on the ELT and pushed down all the data transformations. And we had this small team of guys at this point, so 6 or 7 people, and they were all talent engineers. So they understood talent, they understood the workflow, they understood that it was component driven, they knew how to configure it. And we wanted to make something that they would very easily iterate to. So it was kind of, we need it to look like talent, and but we need it to be ELT. And that was kind of what we sat down and tried to build. 3 or 4 developers, and we just went for it. And the idea is that we would
still with the plan of just servicing these customers,
just servicing these customers, and the customers for it would be the 6 or 7 guys internal at Matillion. And so 2014, I think we started summer 2014, and we had something that we could use internally by February 2015. So the beginning of 2015, we started using it internally. And what we didn't realize at the time is that one thing that successful startups do is that they create a very tight loop between their customer and themselves, so they can get a really tight feedback loop. in the early days of the product so they can figure out what works and what doesn't work very easily.
Right.
And we had accidentally created this by having 4 developers and 6 data engineers sat in the same room, and the developers would push something out, and the data engineers would walk across the room and say, I don't like this, that's in the wrong place, and this doesn't work properly, but the other stuff's good. And they carried on like that for a few months. And I think at that point we'd start to realize, hey, this is useful for us. Maybe it's useful for somebody else. So
now, did you have a GUI for it and everything, or was
so it was? Yeah, it was kind of. This may just be me, but the way I think about software is GUI first. And a lot of my engineers, they like start, I'll build a model and a data model. I got the GUI. What's going to look like? And then I can figure out the rest from that. Yeah. So I think that might have just been me, but yeah, it was very kind of GUI led, and that came from that. It needs to look like Talon. It needs to be easy to transition to for an engineer that's used to using Talon.
Yeah.
So the kind of the flash of like where everything kind of joined together was AWS had just had this new idea called Marketplace. So they wanted to build like an app store for business apps on AWS, and they were asking anyone that would listen, hey, do you fancy deploying your app on AWS? So we thought, hey, what's the worst that could happen? We'll package this up. And there was like a load of incentives and stuff if you deployed your app on AWS. And one of the incentives was you get to go for like half price out to Vegas to reInvent, and they'll give you a booth. We're like, oh, that sounds like a fun thing to do. So we packaged up the software, we put it on the marketplace, and then that year, reInvent was at a weird time. It was like early. It was like August, September time.
Yeah, they're usually like November.
Yeah, and we went out with like 4 guys and a homemade, like a banner that we'd put in hand luggage that we'd had made. I think the budget, because at this point, our seed investor, we're still a seed round company at this point, and our seed investors had kind of topped up the pot a little bit, and they were starting to get a little bit itchy. It's like, is this really going to work? And we wanted to and obviously the new product thing was a bit of a pivot and a bit of a bet. And of course, we didn't make out at the time that it was that much of a pivot. We were just like, oh, don't worry about it. It's core business, but we're just this other idea that we want to try out. And anyway, so we went. So we put it on the marketplace, and shortly before we went out to reInvent, the way that the marketplace worked back then was they gave you really basic telemetry. It was like, you've got a customer, this is their identifier, and they're in this geo.
Okay.
And that was basically it. They've used this much of your product, and you're going to get paid. Like, I think we charged $1.37 an hour for the product to start with. And so this customer pings up, and they're like, and it's like, this customer, it's in Australia. Handy if you're in the UK.
Exactly.
And they're paying $1.37 an hour. And it was about 2 months before we kind of figured out, just through like sleuthing and looking at web logs, who this customer was, and eventually got in touch with them. And it was PricewaterhouseCoopers Australia.
Nice.
And they were like, oh, yeah, we needed an ELT tool, and we could tell that yours had been built by data engineers, so we just used that, and it's great. And we were like, oh, good feedback. And they're still a customer today. That's awesome. So they just picked up this brand new product, and they were. I don't think they realized they were customer number one. We certainly didn't tell them. And then we went to reInvent, and we were swamped. I mean, it was a heady time, because we just, like, the expo floor opens, and we're in this, like, we weren't in a terrible booth. We were just like in a regular booth in a regular corner of the expo, and just a million people turned up. And because the product is quite visual, it was just like I was just banging out demo after demo after demo after demo for 3 days. I was absolutely exhausted. But yeah, everything else just
not what you
went
expected from a Vegas trip.
Well, there was all of the other things that I expected from a Vegas trip were pretty much in there, but there was a lot of time on the expo floor doing demos. So
that's great.
So was that kind of was it just obvious at that point that we're changing the trajectory of the company?
It became obvious pretty quickly, and then you could see from the rate at which it was being picked up on the marketplace that
was it right from that event, or was it prior to that?
It was really right from that event. It was very little up until that event, and then it was right from that event. And at that point, it was kind of okay. We need to figure out how to market it properly. We need to figure out how to support it properly. It was all from there. It was figuring out how you make the business.
Was the support difficult just because you had this smaller team and then all of a sudden you've got this lurch?
Yeah, it was. I guess when it's a small team, the support is tricky, but you essentially have to put your best people right there on the front line.
You've got developers doing support essentially.
Yeah, exactly. So you've got developers. We quickly started realizing that some of the guys that were part of the BI business were very easy to transfer into solution architect roles because these guys have been like using the software for longer than anyone, and they've been building data warehouses for 3 or 4 years. So they knew what the customer was trying to achieve, and they knew the software, so they could very easily transition into being solution architects. And a lot of them are still, almost all of them, I think, are still with Matillion in fairly senior roles that have at least at some time been solution architects. And also you get all the product feedback. So I remember support being hard. To be honest with you, I don't think it was harder than the support that we'd been doing on the BI business, because that was really hard.
I can imagine that certainly is true.
I used to get up at 6 o'clock every morning because all these BI processes would run overnight, and they were all run on processes that I had built. And I'm not the world's greatest software engineer. I'm very happy to admit that. So very often I would get up in the morning and say, hey, how many of my 40 customers' BI processes have run? None of them. Okay, right. So I need to sort that out before they get into work at 8 o'clock in the morning. So they've got they get all their reports.
How did you transition that? Because here you had all these customers that were using you guys for the services of BI.
Yeah.
And now, like, hey guys, we're going to become a product company. We're not going to be doing. I mean, are you still doing that? Or what did you do?
We're still doing it. We're still with the BI business. We still have a handful of customers running on our BI business and a small team that just look after that.
Wow.
Yeah, it's still there.
Hopefully, all of Matillion now.
Yeah, and it became a Matillion. It became a kind of values of the company kind of thing. So one of our values is customer obsession, and so whether it's like we're not hard-headed enough or not, but it's like these guys were very, very hard-won customers at the time, and they've continued to be customers. They've continued to pay revenue, so we'll continue to support them as long as they want to. So we've never up until this point, we've never kind of sunset that product or anything.
Yeah, one thing that is interesting about that is it almost provides it provides your team like with real use cases, and you're so connected to the product, but it's like real use cases. It's not like a lot of times
that's part of the reason we keep it. It's super valuable. So one of the things that we do, for example, is the BI team always get early versions of Matillion ETL. So they act as a fantastic kind of canary in the coal mine. When we put out a new version of the software, BI team pick it up, and they get it for a couple of weeks, and then it goes into general release, as well as all the other testing we do, of course. But it's just an extra kind of stage in the process that gives us a degree of confidence.
Yeah, I really
I think that's an interesting point, because a lot of times one of the challenges with being a pure software vendor, not being a practitioner, is that you lose sight of sort of you have a good sight of, yes, you're moving data, but you don't necessarily see how the adoption of that software happens. You only see whether people are using it or not using it. So being practitioners is a big value proposition. I think it gives you a lot of insight. Ed, you touched on something else that I think is critically important, and sometimes as Intricity, we are focused on educating. Certainly the Intricity 101 channel is focused on educating. The idea and the difference between a data lake and that final layer, sometimes referred to as the data warehouse or the conformed layer, its importance is sometimes difficult to explain. How do you explain it to customers?
Yeah, so I guess I quite often start by describing the fact that the lines are quite blurred, actually. And there's kind of convergence going on between data warehouses and data lakes, and that's been going on ever since. So Redshift started off. We started off. Matillion's first product was Matillion ETL for Redshift. I know we want to get into kind of the Snowflake, and we definitely will. But Matillion ETL for Redshift, and Redshift was kind of the biggest gig in town. It was, I think, for about 2 years, it was AWS's fastest growing product.
Yeah.
And it was quite expensive. It was a lot of the AWS stack at that time was, EC2 was seen as quite cheap. S3 was seen as quite cheap. There was a lot of downward pressure on prices, but Redshift came along and was quite expensive and grew like crazy. So Redshift, and then this conversion started to happen. So there was Redshift, and then the data lake product that AWS released later was Athena, which was, I can't remember the name of the Apache product, but it was an Apache product that was that they'd taken and fettled, basically. And then that became part of the kind of Glue ecosystem. But what they did probably 2016, 2017 was they essentially blended data from Athena and Redshift. So you can see Athena data in Redshift and vice versa. And that's really where the lake met the warehouse. Mm-hmm. And ever since then, that kind of intersection of the technology has gradually been improved. So it starts to become less and less relevant. It's like, is my data in the lake or is my data in the warehouse?
Yeah.
Do you care?
Right.
And as you've gone on with Snowflake, that's got even more blurred. Even more blurred. So when you get down to dealing with very large quantities of data, it does start to make sense to still understand how that underlying technology is working, particularly because if you've got vast quantities of IoT data, it probably doesn't make sense to load that data into Snowflake. You want to put that into some kind of cheap storage in the lake, and then maybe ingest and aggregate it down to a smaller data set, depending on what you want to see inside kind of first class Redshift, first class Snowflake tables. So you do see data architects wanting to think about that sort of thing. A lot of people can get away with really almost not thinking about that. And I expect where we'll get to in the next few years is Snowflake, others like Databricks. They will really just start to take care of that for you. If you look at Databricks' Delta Lake product, it's like, we've built a data warehouse on a data lake. Okay, how do I need to consider where my data is actually at any point? Don't worry about it. We'll take care of it. And I think that's where we're going. We start to talk about lake house, which is the kind of conversion term.
Just to confuse people a little bit more.
Yeah, because it's not confusing enough. But ultimately, the things that always amaze me as constant. So in all the changing of the technology, and the rise of Redshift, and then the rise of Snowflake and Databricks and all the others in the ecosystem, there's a few things that remain constant, and we see customers are trying to do. They're trying to do ETL. They love SQL. People still build in SQL, and they still like to build data warehouses and data vaults. So they'll do Kimball-style data warehouses with facts and dimensions. And they were invented in the 70s, and they're still good. Those concepts are still good.
Right.
And perhaps some of the larger enterprises, they will build data vaults, which I find them too heavyweight. But once you get into a big enterprise, you start to realize where and why they make sense. So to reach out to Jared's kind of student data scientists that are just coming into this really exciting technology market, the things that will stand you in good stead all the way through. Really understand SQL, understand the nuts and bolts of what goes into a data warehouse, what a dimension is, and how you can fit those together and how you can use them to represent data. And if you're really into it, it's worth understanding how to put together a data vault. That's
right.
Really exciting.
One of the questions that I wanted to ask you is about that transition when Snowflake sort of came in. It's funny, you can almost look at the market, before Snowflake and after Snowflake, because it was a pretty big disruption. It was like, BC and then AD. It's like there's this huge data market disruption where it forced, I would say, a lot of the cloud vendors to reassess how they were running queries and how their architectures were being laid out. And I would say just hearing the backstory of where you guys came from, you were in a really good position to it's all starting to kind of mesh together now, kind of where you guys were. Was it just a total natural thing and, did it just all fall in place, or, was there a lot of rework you guys had to do to support Snowflake?
So I'd like to say that we were geniuses and we just saw it from the very start. That would be disingenuous. Also, I could have just packed it in and just invested all my money in Snowflake. And
exactly.
Wouldn't have had to all do this annoying software writing stuff, right? but no.
It's still not too late, perhaps, to do that.
Well, perhaps not. So Snowflake came along. We were fairly early. So we started to hunt around for other data platforms that you could push data down to. And I think the thinking at the time, there were two kind of players out there that we were interested in. So one was Google BigQuery. And then there was this little upstart, which people were starting to talk about, called Snowflake. And this goes to show that we weren't as smart as we thought we were. So we decided we'll do BigQuery first. And so what that meant was that we'd built Matillion ETL for Redshift. That was the name of the product, because what does it name it? It was a very useful name, because it was like, this is exactly what it does.
Right.
It was also very useful at that Vegas booth, because it was like for Redshift. So if anybody had Redshift, come talk to us. You don't know what Redshift is. He wasted that time. Go away. So we wanted to build Matillion ETL for something else, because we saw people asking us about other data warehouse platforms, and we decided that BigQuery was the way to go for some reason. Probably not a particularly scientific reason, but what that meant is we had to build the abstractions into the product. So the product that had been built around Redshift previously, you had to kind of extract all of the Redshift bits and kind of put them in a box, and then you had to create an equivalent box for GCP. And what that meant, of course, was you could then iterate very quickly to Snowflake, and we did. We did exactly that. So I think
So did you take that sort of the front end componentry and sort of detach it so that you could just say whatever SQL we have to write, this is going to
separate the SQL syntax from the tools. So this way you could plug in whatever SQL is appropriate.
Exactly that. So one of the kind of core bits of secret sauce in Matillion is the SQL generation. So you have and it's not a million miles away, I guess, from your sort of central metadata language that you have in BladeBridge, but it's SQL components that you've seen as a kind of a diagram that you lay out, that gets transformed into a complex SQL statement, and then that SQL statement is optimized for Redshift, BigQuery, Snowflake, Synapse, Databricks right now. But yeah, Snowflake and BigQuery came out. We brought those products to market probably within 3 or 4 months of each other. And Snowflake, they both got off to a pretty good start, but Snowflake started to go,
really explode,
go crazy at exactly the same time as Snowflake. And being in a little bit earlier meant we got a higher attach rate to Snowflake, and it meant that we could partner with them more closely, and having separate products, so it would be Matillion ETL 4, and then essentially have 3 separate products off of the one code base. But having separate products allowed us to go in and extract some of the kind of USP of that underlying data warehouse. And in Snowflake's case, there was quite a lot of USP. They went to market with a really strong semi-structured data handling, which they still have, actually. It's still probably best in the business at dealing with semi-structured data. And it was at the time everyone was starting to move to, I want everything in JSON. I want to pull data from NoSQL databases like Mongo and Cassandra. So everything was starting to come in as these JSON blobs, and Snowflake handles that beautifully. And we were able to build tooling to make that even easier, because it's actually still quite complicated to write SQL over NoSQL.
Dot notation,
Yeah, all that dot notation stuff. So if you can make something more visual and guided for the customer, that's a real benefit. And then the other big USP, of course, with Snowflake has always been the separation of storage and compute. So it allowed us to do things like we can build a data pipeline where you essentially turn on the Snowflake compute, or you turn up the Snowflake compute so there's more of it, run your data pipeline at maximum speed, and then turn it down at the end. And then, that's great for the customer because they're using what they need. Actually, it's also great for Snowflake because we were pushing everything down and forcing consumption in Snowflake. And that's still why we are, you might have seen recently announced as Snowflake's #1 partner for data integration tools this year. So
awesome.
Congratulations on that, by the way.
Yeah, thanks. It does feel like a real achievement, that.
It is.
With those guys for so long.
And I think, again, Jared and I often have private conversations in terms of the where the marketplace is going and where migrations are going, especially the world of Hadoop. And you touched on Hadoop a little bit. Obviously, had held a lot of promise, but did not necessarily deliver for typical business use cases. And the fact that Snowflake stores data in blob storage, you don't pay the penalty of Athena or Presto, I think is the open source tool that Athena is built on. And so this future of what's the right technology, people are building things with things that are recommended, whether it's through their system integrators or maybe it's the software vendors. The beauty of ELT and what Matillion has done is allow those independent engines to do all of the heavy lifting. And so you can act as the engine that does the orchestration, it does the best practice SQL generation, but you leave all of that heavy lift and all of that processing where it best belongs, which is an MPP database like Snowflake or Redshift or whatever it might be in the future.
Now, Ed, you and I, we've been on some calls with the BladeBridge team, and I took notice of something Simon Eligolashvili said. He said on one of the calls, and by the way, Simon is slated later to do a Data Shark episode as well. But I remember him saying that Matillion metadata is exceptionally clean, and that's basically the configuration backend of Matillion. Sort of the importable code to generate Matillion, and coming from Simon, that really means something because he has actually touched pretty much every ETL tool at this point. And so So I'm curious how you approached the design of Matillion to nail down the design like that. Was it just a result of this client interaction and being able to do it with the client, or just the frustration of having to maintain that and you wanted to clean it, you know, or was it just, hey, another lucky
How did
win?
you simplify complexity
Yeah,
when
yeah.
it comes to metadata?
Or, was there a process that you were using or something like that? Because it is very clean, particularly compared to a lot of ETL tools. I think a lot of ETL tools, they think, hey, nobody's going to see this information. It's not part of our GUI. And so we don't, just park it and make it, you can make it whatever you want, but then it just becomes this gobbledygook. So I am curious about this part.
It's a great question. Do you know what? I think I'm probably as curious as you are, Jared, because it's not. But you only know because
I love it.
Because so Simon. Simon's fantastic. Simon comes across his breadth of knowledge on ETL tools is amazing. So you're absolutely right to have him say, "Hey, this looks clean. This metadata is really clean. I really like it. It's really flattering." But of course, we certainly didn't spend a lot of time looking at other ETL tools metadata, and he's in the unique position where he's doing that kind of day in, day out. So we didn't know. I didn't know it was clean, right? Really, I had a kind of inkling. I'd certainly seen Talon's metadata model, but yeah, we didn't really know it was clean. Comparatively compared to everything else. I certainly hadn't looked at Informatica. I hadn't looked at.
I almost think it is because you had to maintain these clients.
I suspect it was. I suspect. I think probably the credit goes to some of the engineers that worked on the product in the early days. So not to me. But I think it came from a philosophy of just keeping it simple. And I guess it was a little bit second comer's advantage. So, to defend some of the kind of sort of first wave ETL tools like Talon and Informatica, they kind of had to figure out what the model should be as you went along. But the kind of second time around, you can think, okay, we understand, what can we do to clean and improve kind of what's gone before, and that's why I wonder if that's where we kind of ended up with Matillion to keep the internal model really clean. And I guess also it helps that the technology had moved on. So at the time, I imagine that some of our competitors were building their tools. XML was de rigueur, so everything got built in XML, and it's not really very nice to iterate on or work with. Whereas Matillion's all based on JSON, so and hey, maybe in 5 years' time everything will be based on YAML or something like that. Everybody will have moved on, and it suddenly won't be considered clean. But yeah, I think it's that. I think it's the design of the model, and being able to kind of perhaps have a slightly younger code base and being the second comer to that. But yeah, so, I don't really have a definite. Did we think about it that much? Probably not. it was probably driven by what we needed to build at the time.
Yeah,
so we didn't.
It was probably simpler and easier to make it simpler and easier than it was to complexify it. And so it might be just a natural progression.
I also wonder if it's the GUI first approach. You know what you want. You know what you're looking for. It's not just a whole bunch of complexity. Built. Kind of like how Arcady. How we build data warehouses. It's majority of cases it's top down. Get the requirements first and then build.
Yeah.
Having the
that's not how the rest of the world unfortunately does it. But I was thinking about that point specifically because if you think about a properly designed data model, it is elegant, it's simple, it's not noisy, it's an entire organization represented in handful of tables versus just doing a data dump from SAP or Salesforce or something of that nature. Yeah.
So a vast majority, of ELT and ETL, it's for analytic use cases, but there are edge cases, things like, data quality, master data management, point to point. Are those markets ever? Do you ever see Matillion kind of going after the more edge casey type of scenarios?
Yeah, I think there's kind of an ecosystem that revolves around the core movement of data, as you quite rightly point out. And those always become decisions about you kind of have to look at the market. So if you look at, say, data catalog tools is somewhere where Matillion wants to play nice, because there are a few fairly established data catalog players in the market, and customers essentially come to us and say, "Hey, I'm using one of these guys. Can you make your metadata available to the data catalog?" And so we've done a lot of work this year on kind of making that a lot easier, integrating with some of these data catalog tools and providing interfaces for more of them. But it's all kind of case by case basis as to I think you'll definitely see Matillion wanting to expand its footprint around the core ETL process. We see opportunities in the design of the data warehouse. We see opportunities kind of the hot topic in town these days tends to be data ops. So there's some really interesting and gnarly problems around, how do you statelessly deploy your data environment when your data is stateful? That's kind of the core. It's like if you can get your head around that, then you can kind of solve this sort of magic problem of data ops and being able to build a CI/CD pipeline around data processes. And I think there's some movement in that market. It's a new area that's kind of been carved out, and I think there's some really interesting opportunities there.
Yeah. We spoke to the CEO of Prefect a while back. And there's a lot of interesting synergy in terms of how we've come to Prefect and what are the opportunities there. But DevOps and Data Ops and sort of those two coming together have been a big part of what we're looking at, because one of the challenges is managing the schema. And how do you manage and promote schema and schema changes in a governed world? The other, of course, is what Matillion generates, which is clean SQL code that ultimately gets executed against these environments. And what's the right life cycle of sort of managing those assets? And then the last mile is the stuff we've been doing in the data modeling world, which is, we talked about facts and dimensions. So type 2 dimensions or type n dimensions, and how do we manage the change? That comes full circle into Snowflake, where we've got this ability to do zero copy cloning and some other things that are fairly unique to the platform, where we're copying metadata instead of data. And so lots of interesting things happening in that space. And I think that's an exciting area to focus on for sure.
So totally. We got about 5 minutes left, and I want to be sure that you get a chance to kind of speak to how a customer can find you guys. What's the, is it just a matter of going to Matillion.com, or is it, do they go to the marketplaces? How are people adopting and whatnot?
Yeah, absolutely. So you can find us on AWS, GCP, and Azure's marketplace. Your best bet is to start at Matillion.com. If you start at Matillion.com, anyone can sign up into our hub, and they can download a free trial for 14 days of Matillion ETL. All you need is an AWS account, and the software will, the hub will guide you through the process of getting the software stood up in that AWS account. And then once you're in there, you can start building ETL processes either with Snowflake or Redshift or GCP, however you want to.
Is it all done by the hour? Is that how the
everything? Yeah. So I mean, you shouldn't be paying anything for 14 days. After that, I think our smaller instance type is $1.79 an hour. So it's quite cheap and easy to get started with Matillion. And nice thing about it, of course, is you're only paying while the product is running and moving data, and you can turn it off, you stop paying, and that kind of consumption model, I think, has been key for kind of the sort of the current generation of products, be it Matillion, Snowflake, Redshift. Everything is very much around that sort of consumption model now.
And does it typically go, people will kind of test it out and then, sort of reach out to the sales teams and say, okay, we want to do sort of a more enterprisey looking deal, or do those deals typically go straight to the sales reps?
So this is something that's gradually changed as Matillion has grown. We've gradually edged more and more towards the enterprise. So what we see nowadays is kind of larger consumption-driven enterprise deals going through. There are still an awful lot of customers that simply start with us, do a trial, and then roll on from that trial and grow. But I think I can share some of the core internal stats of the company. I'll probably get these wrong. My CEO will shoot me, but I think we have about 130% net dollar retention. So that kind of gives you an indication of year on year how much customers grow. So generally, customers grow, I can't remember what the other figure I was going to quote was, but
I think we talked about it before we went live. I think during the COVID period, sort of an increase. I think you mentioned 2.5 times increase in data consumption is quite incredible.
Yeah, and I think that's very much. Actually, Matillion doesn't charge our customers based on the amount of data that they move. Right. It's very much just charged around the cost of running the software right now. So you can run very small workloads or very large workloads for a similar cost. Generally, customers scale because they start to build dev, test, and production environments, and then they split off projects and go and run extra instances of the software elsewhere. And that's kind of how we see the growth in a customer. But for the underlying data warehouse platforms, particularly Snowflake and Databricks, that growth in data that's gonna drive those guys to even greater heights, I think, than their current.
Yeah. Well, Ed, thank you very much for, and I know it's a little late there because you're joining in from England, so I appreciate you staying
it's
late.
6 o'clock. It's not too bad. It's not too bad.
You've just gotten used to.
There's still sun outside the window.
Yeah.
You've just gotten used to the late U.S. meetings. So, but I do appreciate you jumping on with us. And if you're interested in looking more at Matillion, go and take a look at Matillion.com. And if you'd like to connect with us about it as well, we'd be happy to chat with you more. Again, thanks again, Ed. Thanks, Arcady, for joining.
Pleasure.
Absolutely. Thank you, Ed.
Jared.
We'll catch you all later.
All right, bye.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.